Hi, my name is Meg, and today I'm presenting on playtesting for better puzzles by trying to measure a challenge. A little about me, I specialize in UX design and user research mostly, and a few years ago got a PhD in games user research where I investigated my favorite genre of video games, puzzle games. Now, without getting into the nuanced academic arguments over the differences between these two words, for our purposes, basically when we talk about game difficulty, we're really referring to the probability of a player failing at a particular task in the game, whereas challenge focuses on how much effort a player is having to put towards successfully completing something in the game, like a puzzle. So really, game difficulty is focusing on game-based metrics like player health or amount of damage they do, whereas challenge is focusing on player-based metrics like how long they're taking to complete a task and how many steps it took them to complete a task. So in part of my PhD, I was really looking at, well, how might we measure the challenge level of puzzles in games? And I've developed a tool that I want to run you through that I hope is generic enough that anyone can use it to start to help playtest the puzzles in your games that you're designing. Again, I'll link to my paper, so if you really want to read into the details, you can, but basically prior research or academic games research in this space really focused on simple arcade games because they were easier to modify for research purposes and really hone in on one variable. There was also a focus on action games because usually they have a score and it's really easy to measure player outcomes. And the closest I could find to measuring or looking at challenge was the Corgus scale, which is like a survey tool that was made up by Denisova. So basically they asked players a bunch of survey sort of questions after the experience, and that gave a rating of perceived level of challenge. But that was sort of at a game or a task level. It wasn't focusing on individual puzzles necessarily. So what we wanted to present or work on was something that could be applied to commercially available puzzle games as opposed to like games made for research. So complex games, actual real puzzle games that really focus on the cognitive challenge rather than a performance-based challenge. An example of a performance-based challenge would be like a fighting game or a first-person shooter game or something where pushing the buttons at the right time is part of the challenge of the game. We wanted to focus only on games where you're really those thinky games where the challenge is really all in the puzzle rather than the controls. And the other thing this tool focuses on is more on player behavior and player metrics rather than surveying the player for their opinion after the fact. So we wanted to be able to measure actual things the player did in relation to solving the puzzles rather than asking them what they thought afterwards. So this is how this kind of differs from the previous work. So we developed the tool by using the Witness and Untitled Goose game because they're both puzzle games, but also the puzzles are really different from one another. And then we validated the tool by testing it on a third game not used in development, which was Barbara Is You. So rather than run you through the whole development process, I thought I'd just run you through what the tool is and then show you how that tool has been applied to these three games. And then some of our findings we found from playtests we ran of these three games with a range of players. So the first question or puzzle characteristic that we're looking at is, can players submit an incorrect solution and receive feedback on that solution for the puzzle? If that is true, then one thing you can count or measure is the number of incorrect solutions that the player has submitted to get feedback on, because that really shows how much effort they're putting into solving the puzzle. The next one is, can players solve the puzzle using extra actions or moves? So is there like an ideal solution with a minimum number of moves, and then can they do extra moves on top of that? If the answer to that is yes, then you can count the number of actions they have used to solve the puzzle to indicate the effort they're putting in. The next puzzle characteristic we're looking at is it clear when a player begins and finishes a puzzle? If so, you can measure how long they took to solve the puzzle. This seems like a really straightforward thing to measure, and in some games it is, but as you'll see with Untitled Goose Game as an example, it can get a little fuzzy at times. Another puzzle characteristic is the puzzle, or are there puzzles in the game that are optional to player progression within the game? So if a player is optional, the player doesn't have to do it. You can look at just whether they attempted but left incomplete, didn't even attempt, or did actually attempt and complete. You can use that sort of status indicator to see which puzzles are not being attempted or being attempted but left incomplete. The other one, which came up with which linked to a few different metrics, was are there multiple solutions to a particular puzzle, in which case you can use time taken to solve, number of actions, and or if there's a specific game metric around efficiency of the solution, like for example, if players have to pay money or put resources into solving a particular puzzle, you could look at how much resources they used. And the last one is, can players use in-game hints? If so, you could count the number of in-game hints they've used. I specify in-game because it would be very hard to measure players seeking help from an external website or a friend or family member. So this is more just focused on if there's a hint system in the game itself, are they using it? So one of the first games we used to help develop this tool and test the tool on was The Witness. In The Witness, the puzzles are on these individual panels. Generally, all of them involve starting at the round circle and making your way to the tail end and having to satisfy a series of rules based on the symbols that you see in the puzzle itself. And the puzzles teach you what those rules are through feedback when you submit solutions. So it looks something like this. So you can also see that you can't really progress to the next puzzle in the sequence until you've completed the one prior. And each puzzle builds on the concepts presented in the previous one. So looking at the puzzle challenge analysis tool, we can see that players can submit incorrect solutions and receive feedback on them as to whether they're right or wrong. They can solve the puzzle using extra actions or moves, and it is very clear when the player begins and finishes the puzzle, so you can easily time how long it takes them to solve. So I can't remember the sample size exactly, but I think we had about 12 to 15 players, measured them running this series of the black and white squares puzzles. So there were 9 puzzles, and you can see for each puzzle the average number of incorrect solutions that they submitted. So looking at how much effort they're putting into submitting those incorrect solutions, and the average time taken to solve for the players. So you can see that as it's not quite a straight linear line going up as we get towards the end, but there's definitely this struggle and challenge, and then as soon as they figure out the rule around the black and white squares, and the rule being, spoiler, that you have to separate the black and white squares with the line that you're drawing, once they seem to click on that, you'll see that on the 8th puzzle it's quite straightforward, and they sort of have that aha moment, and after the aha moment they speed up, but then the last puzzle is quite challenging still. One other area I quickly wanted to mention that we did measure a lot of players running through was the symmetry island area, whereby you draw one line and there's sort of like a mirror image line happening in the same grid, and you have to draw it such that you can get to the end, and then towards the latter half of these puzzles it starts to introduce these little coloured hexagons which you have to collect with the relevant line, whether it's blue or yellow. So it does get quite complex, from starting off being like a maze to having to also collect the right hexagon colors and thinking in mirror images. So you can see over a longer sequence of puzzles, we're seeing the tutorial easier puzzles start off being quite easy and simple and they're getting the correct solution most of the time. Those ones were sort of simple mazes, so it was really hard to get those wrong. And you can see as we progress further and further and the puzzles get more and more complicated, we're seeing players get stuck in submitting a lot more incorrect solutions and spending a lot more time trying to figure out these puzzles. And I think the point of these graphs is not to say this is right or this is wrong, but to give you a better picture of how players are experiencing challenge across the puzzles in your game, so you can then go and tweak the design to match what you want it to be. So you definitely want those first few tutorial puzzles to be easy, to be quick, and to not be resulting in the player having to try too hard. So the second game we ran used to help develop this tool was Untitled Goose Game. If you haven't played it already, it's an adorable game and I highly recommend. Made here in Australia, in Melbourne. So the game involves you as a goose running around trying to do a series of tasks and cause mischief around a little village, and you start in this garden area. And so you can clearly see once you've completed a task, you get this feedback that it's crossed off your to-do list. So we analysed the first area, the garden area, and re-recorded about 12 to 15 players run through this first area. So these were the tasks that the players had to do. In Untitled Goose Game, you have the option to leave one of the first 6 tasks incomplete. So you only have to complete 5 of the 6 to be able to progress to the next area, and then you have to do 1.7 to open up the next area of the game. So you can see that players can do extra actions and moves. It's a little fuzzier around how long it takes them to solve the puzzle. There are optional puzzles to progression within the game, and there are definitely multiple solutions to these puzzles. So you can see here for the garden area, task 1.4 and task 1.6 were the most challenging. And if we look at which ones were attempted but left incomplete, you'll see not many players completed task 1.4. So let's have a bit of a look at what that was. Task 1.4 was to make the groundskeeper wear his sun hat. In the game, it kind of looks like this, where as the goose you can see it, but you actually can't reach it or pull it off the door. And there are multiple ways to solve this puzzle, but they are not obvious. And it requires quite a bit of playing around to figure out how to do this one. Moving on to our third game, Baba Is You. It's this lovely little logic game where you are a little rabbit and you can push around and move objects on a screen, but you can also push around and move and change the rules of each level, and you have to change these rules in order to complete the levels. So for this game, players can use extra actions and moves. We counted one step as being one move. It's very clear when the player begins and finishes the puzzle. They're essentially individual levels, and there are often multiple solutions to the puzzles as well. So having a look at the first few levels of the game, with 0 being the tutorial level you just saw, you can see that the player's average number of actions is often quite a lot higher than the minimum number needed to solve the puzzle. And the average time to solve varied quite a lot, but you can see a lot of people struggled on puzzle number 5, which was the volcano level, which looks like this. I won't go into detail around the answer and whatnot, just suffice to say it took quite a lot of experimentation and people took quite a while to figure out how to complete this one. So this one was definitely one of the more challenging ones out of those first 7 levels. I think the only thing we didn't really cover that I wanted to call out with those 3 games was game-specific metrics, like we talked about resources. I think a series of games that does this well, the other Zachtronics puzzle games, where at the end of each level you get this histogram to compare your performance with other players. So in some of the games you're spending money on designing a solution, or it might be using a certain number of blocks, or in this case they called it production cost, power usage and lines of code. So you can see how efficient your solution is in comparison to others. Before I go, I just want to say this way of thinking about and measuring challenge in puzzles is not perfect. So you do need to be careful how you interpret and what you're measuring. So in the case of what I'm showing you, using 2 measures is way better than 1 at finding which puzzles are the most challenging. Each metric does have its own limitations, and combining 2 gives you, like in the graphs I showed you, gives you a much better picture of which puzzles are challenging, and being able to compare. For example, in Untitled Goose Game, trying to find when players started and finished a puzzle is really difficult because they could jump between different tasks. I had one player put the rake in the lake, and the gardener or groundskeeper went to go and get it out of the lake, as the AI is sort of programmed to do, and in doing so unintentionally completed the get the groundskeeper wet task without even trying. So the time for that player to complete that task would have technically been 0. So it's not a great measure on its own. Also, the measure of time taken for Untitled Goose Game will be way less precise and accurate than that taken for something like The Witness, where it's really clear when a player does and starts and finishes on a puzzle panel. So you can't really compare numbers or metrics across games. It's purely used to compare across puzzles within the same game and to help you get the flow of your puzzle challenge correct, or as you want it in one particular game. And the other thing that, like we said earlier, was chance can sometimes affect the outcome, like the non-player character behavior in Untitled Goose Game. So we didn't really account for that in our measures. So yeah, it's definitely worth taking some notes and knowing that you need to take these numbers with a grain of salt. They're not perfect. They're just there to give you an indication, because it's very difficult to measure something as nuanced and like human as challenge. But thanks for listening. I'm kind of sometimes on X, but otherwise on LinkedIn. And if you have any questions, shoot them through. I may not be online right now, but I'll be on the Discord if you have any questions, and I'll send you a link to my paper if you really, really, really want to hear the ins and outs of how this tool was developed, and some of the conversations and links to other papers like Dr. Anderson's around challenge and difficulty and problem solving in video games. Thanks.